The thunderous applause echoed through the crystal halls of the Galactic Senate as Princess Camilla Voss walked toward the massive doors that would seal her fate forever. Her boots clicked against the polished floor with each measured step, the sound somehow carrying above the cheering crowd of senators and dignitaries from across the galaxy. She kept her chin high, her shoulders straight, even as the weight of exile pressed down on her like a dying star. Behind her, Emperor Theron Voss sat on his throne of pure energy, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. The man who had once called her his beloved daughter now watched her departure with the same expression he might wear while disposing of faulty equipment. The irony wasn't lost on Camilla that the very qualities he had once praised in her, her compassion for lesser species, her questioning of imperial doctrine, her refusal to see non-humans as expendable resources, were now the charges that condemned her. Let it be recorded, the Emperor's voice boomed through the chamber, enhanced by neural amplifiers that made every word resonate in the bones of those present, that Princess Camilla Voss, heir apparent to the Terran imperial throne, has been found guilty of treason against humanity, conspiracy with alien insurgents, and violation of the sacred human supremacy doctrine. She is hereby stripped of all titles, all rights of succession, and all citizenship within the Terran Empire. The crowd erupted again, their approval washing over her like acid rain. Senators from 100 human worlds raised their fists in celebration, their faces twisted with the kind of righteous fury that only comes from believing yourself superior to every other living being in the galaxy. Admiral Corex, her father's chief military advisor, smiled with predatory satisfaction from his position near the throne. The man had been pushing for this moment for years, ever since Camilla had first questioned why human colonies were built on the ashes of alien civilizations. Furthermore, the Emperor continued, and the hall fell silent again, she is to be exiled to the Dead Zone, that lawless sector beyond the galactic rim where the lowest forms of alien scum make their nests. She will be given a single ship, basic provisions, and exactly 72 hours to reach the outer boundary. After that time, any human vessel encountering her is authorized to destroy her on sight. Camilla finally turned around, facing her father one last time. Even at this distance, she could see the cold calculation in his eyes, the way he measured her reaction like data on a tactical display. This wasn't justice, it was theater. A performance designed to send a message to every human in the galaxy about what happened when you showed weakness, when you suggested that perhaps the Empire's endless expansion might not be worth the countless alien lives it cost. I have one final statement, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber without amplification. The natural acoustics of the hall had been designed by the Androxians, an artistic species the Empire had enslaved decades ago. Even in exile, she would be reminded of the cost of human ambition. Emperor Theron raised one hand, a gesture that granted permission but also warning. Around the chamber, palace guards shifted slightly, their plasma weapons humming with barely contained energy. They wouldn't kill her here, that would make her a martyr, but they would silence her if she went too far. I stand before you today not as a traitor, but as someone who dared to ask a simple question, Camilla began, her gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd. What gives us the right to declare ourselves the masters of the galaxy? What makes human life more valuable than that of the Krellian farmer whose world we bombed to ash? What makes our expansion more important than the survival of the Velix children who were sold into slavery to fund our war machine? The murmur of disapproval started low but grew quickly. Several senators rose from their seats, shouting accusations and demands for her immediate removal. But Emperor Theron held up his hand again, allowing her to continue. He wanted this moment recorded, wanted history to show how he had dealt with weakness in his own bloodline. I have traveled to the edges of our empire, Camilla continued, raising her voice to be heard over the growing disturbance. I have seen the refugee camps on Proxima 7, where survivors of our liberation campaigns huddle in the ruins of their cities. I have walked through the slave markets on New Gibraltar, where alien children are sold like livestock to the highest bidder. I have stood on the bridge of battleships as they reduced entire worlds to rubble in the name of human superiority. Now the crowd was on its feet, their shouts of traitor and alien lover filling the air like a storm. But Camilla pressed on, her voice never wavering. And, through it all, I kept asking myself, when did we become the monsters our ancestors would have fought against? When did we decide that conquest was more important than conscience? When did the dream of human greatness become a nightmare for every other species in the galaxy? Enough. Admiral Korex stepped forward, his hand moving to his sidearm. Your Imperial Majesty, this treasonous speech goes beyond. No, Admiral, the Emperor said quietly, but his words somehow carried over the chaos. Let her finish. Let the galaxy hear exactly what kind of poison has infected my own bloodline. Camilla felt something cold settle in her chest at those words. Not anger, not hurt, something deeper and more dangerous. For 28 years, she had tried to be the daughter he wanted while holding on to her own principles. She had graduated top of her class at the Imperial Academy, had led successful campaigns against pirate fleets, had done everything expected of an Imperial heir. But, it had never been enough, because she couldn't stop seeing the alien faces in the rubble of conquered worlds. You want to know what poison infected me, father? The word came out like a curse. It was the poison of seeing a Thaxarian mother hold her dying child after our bombardment of New Centauri. It was the poison of watching Xylophane refugees freeze to death in our temporary relocation camps. It was the poison of realizing that our empire is built on a foundation of bones that stretches from here to the galactic core. The Emperor's expression didn't change, but Camilla caught the slight tightening around his eyes. She had crossed a line, and they both knew it. And, if that makes me a traitor, she said, turning back toward the great doors, then, I am proud to be one. The palace guards moved to escort her, but she waved them off. She would walk to her exile with dignity, even if it killed her. Behind her, the crowd's anger had reached a fever pitch, but she no longer cared what they thought. These people had chosen to embrace hatred and call it strength. They had chosen to see genocide as glory. As she approached the doors, Captain Rhys Hawthorne stepped out from the ranks of the honor guard. He was younger than her by 5 years, a rising star in the Imperial Navy who had served under her command during the Outer Rim campaigns. His face was carefully neutral, but she caught the slight nod he gave her, a gesture of respect that could cost him his career if the wrong person noticed. Your Highness, he said formally, offering her a data pad. Your ship assignment and departure instructions. She took the pad and quickly scanned its contents. They were giving her the Defiant, a light cruiser that had seen better days. It was armed, at least, though hardly a match for the modern warships that would be hunting her once her grace period expired. The ship was already being loaded with basic supplies, food, water, medical equipment, and enough fuel to reach the dead zone if she was careful. Thank you, Captain, she said, meeting his eyes briefly. In that moment, she saw something that gave her the first spark of hope she'd felt all day. Not sympathy, Rhys Hawthorne was too good a soldier for that. But, doubt. Questions that he was probably asking himself for the first time. Ma'am, he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the crowd, for what it's worth, there are others who have been thinking about the things you said on Proxima 7. It was a dangerous admission, one that could see him court-martialed if overheard. But, it told her something important, the seeds of doubt she had been planting for years were finally starting to sprout. Then, my exile isn't the end, she said. It's the beginning. The great doors of the Senate chamber began to open, revealing the vast spaceport beyond. Her ship waited there, looking small and insignificant against the backdrop of the orbital city that surrounded the palace. In a few hours, she would be aboard that ship, leaving behind everything she had ever known. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, freedom. As she stepped through the doors, the applause reached its crescendo. The crowd was cheering her departure, celebrating what they saw as the purging of weakness from their glorious empire. They thought they were watching the end of a threat to human supremacy. They were wrong. They were watching the birth of the galaxy's greatest hope for peace. The doors sealed behind her with a sound like thunder, cutting off the applause and leaving her alone in the docking bay's vast space. Service robots scurried around her ship, completing the final preparations for departure. She could see the crew assignments on her data pad, a skeleton crew of disgraced officers and enlisted personnel who had asked too many uncomfortable questions during their service. Perfect. As she walked toward the Defiant, Camilla began to plan. The dead zone wasn't called dead because nothing lived there, it was called dead because the great powers of the galaxy had written it off as worthless. The sector contained dozens of refugee populations, survivors of conquest and genocide who had fled to the one place the major empires couldn't be bothered to claim. It was also home to pirates, smugglers, and other criminals who preyed on the weak and desperate. But it was also home to something else, hope. In her years of traveling the Empire's borders, Camilla had made contact with underground networks that helped alien refugees escape persecution. She had built relationships with resistance leaders from a dozen species, all of whom shared a common dream of a galaxy where might didn't automatically make right. The Empire thought they were exiling her to die in obscurity among the alien scum of the galaxy's edge. Instead, they were sending her exactly where she needed to be to build something new. Something better. As she reached the boarding ramp of her ship, Camilla paused and looked back at the palace one last time. Somewhere in those crystal towers, her father sat on his throne of energy, probably already planning his next campaign of conquest. Admiral Corex would be drawing up target lists for alien worlds that hadn't yet submitted to human rule. The Senate would be debating new laws to restrict the rights of non-human populations even further. Let them. While they looked inward, consumed with their own superiority and blinded by their hatred, she would be building alliances they couldn't imagine. She would be giving hope to species they had written off as conquered. She would be creating something that would ultimately prove more powerful than all their fleets and armies combined, a coalition united not by fear or dominance, but by the simple belief that all life had value. The service robots finished their work and retreated to safe positions as the Defiant's engines began to warm up. Her skeleton crew was already aboard, probably wondering what kind of suicide mission they had volunteered for. She would need to address them soon, to explain what they were really doing and give them the chance to back out if they chose. But, first, she wanted one more moment to appreciate the irony of her situation. The Terran Empire, in their arrogance and hatred, had just handed their greatest enemy exactly what she needed to destroy them. They had given her freedom. They had given her a cause that would inspire billions. And, most importantly, they had given her a ship. As the great doors of the docking bay began to open, revealing the star-filled void beyond, Princess Camilla Voss, now simply Camilla, citizen of nowhere and friend to all who suffered under tyranny, climbed aboard her vessel and prepared to begin the most important journey of her life. Behind her, the capital of the greatest human empire in galactic history sparkled like a jewel against the darkness. Ahead of her lay the dead zone, lawless and dangerous and full of possibilities. The hunt would begin in 72 hours. She intended to be ready. The Defiant dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the dead zone exactly 68 hours after leaving the Imperial capital. Camilla stood on the bridge, watching the sensor displays show absolutely nothing where a normal star chart would have marked navigation beacons, shipping lanes, and patrol routes. Out here, beyond the reach of any major power, space truly was empty and dark. Final position confirmed, Commander, said Lieutenant Sarah Chen from the navigation station. She had been demoted from captain after questioning orders to bombard civilian shelters during the Kepler campaign. Like everyone else aboard the Defiant, she carried the invisible scars of trying to do the right thing in an empire that rewarded only blind obedience. Thank you, Lieutenant, Camilla replied, still getting used to her new unofficial rank. Technically, she held no rank at all anymore, but the crew needed some kind of command structure. Set course for the Nexus. Best possible speed without burning out our engines. The Nexus was a massive space station built inside a hollowed-out asteroid, located deep in the heart of the dead zone. It served as a neutral meeting point for the dozens of refugee populations, resistance groups, and independent traders who called this lawless region home. Getting there would take them through some of the most dangerous space in the galaxy, but it was also their best hope of making contact with the networks Camilla had been building for years. "Ma'am," called Ensign Marcus Webb from the communications station, "I'm picking up a distress signal. Bearing 27 Mark 6, approximately 3 light hours out." Camilla frowned at the tactical display. According to their charts, that area should have been completely empty. No worlds, no stations, no shipping routes worth mentioning. "Can you identify the source?" "Working on it," Webb said, his fingers dancing over his controls. The young man had been kicked out of the Imperial Academy for refusing to participate in what the instructors called enhanced interrogation training, torture, in other words. "Signal is weak and heavily distorted. Appears to be Velic's origin, ma'am." The bridge fell silent. Everyone knew about the Velics, a peaceful trading species that had been one of the first to be conquered by the expanding Terran Empire. Their homeworld had been turned into a massive factory complex, their people scattered as slave labor across human space. According to official reports, they had been successfully integrated into imperial society. According to reality, most of them had been worked to death. "Plot an intercept course," Camilla ordered. "And bring us to yellow alert. If there are Velic survivors out here, they might not trust a human ship." The Defiant altered course, her engines pushing them through space toward the distress signal. As they drew closer, the ship's more powerful sensors began to resolve details about the source. What they found made Camilla's heart sink. "It's a refugee convoy," Lieutenant Chen reported grimly. 5 ships, all showing massive damage. Engine failures, hull breaches, life support critical on 3 of them. They're barely holding together. Through the bridge's main viewer, they could see the convoy limping through space like wounded animals. The ships were clearly cobbled together from salvage, old cargo haulers, decommissioned passenger liners, even what looked like a converted mining vessel. Each one was packed far beyond its intended capacity with refugees fleeing some unnamed disaster. "Ma'am," Ensign Webb said urgently, "I'm getting communication from the lead ship. It's in Velic's trade language, but I think I can manage a rough translation." "Put it through." The speaker crackled with static, and, then, a voice emerged, high-pitched and musical, but strained with exhaustion and fear. Webb listened intently, his face growing pale as he translated. "They're saying, they're the last survivors from the Kappa sector colonies. Imperial forces arrived 3 days ago and they sterilized 7 worlds. Complete orbital bombardment. The refugees managed to escape, but their ships are failing. They're requesting assistance from any vessel that can help." Camilla felt ice form in her chest. The Kappa sector was home to nearly 2 billion Velics, living on agricultural worlds that had been established long before humans had even left their home system. They had surrendered peacefully to the Empire, accepting tributary status in exchange for being left alone. It had been one of the few success stories of imperial expansion, a conquered species that had been allowed to maintain their culture and way of life. Apparently, that had changed. "Open a channel," she ordered. "All frequencies." "Channel open, ma'am." Camilla took a deep breath and began speaking in the Velic's trade language, her pronunciation careful but clear. She had spent months learning it during her travels, knowing that communication was the first step toward understanding. "Velic's vessels, this is the Terran ship Defiant. We have received your distress call and are approaching to render assistance. Do not be afraid, we are not Imperial forces. Repeat, we are not Imperial forces. We are here to help." The response came quickly, the voice tight with suspicion and desperation. Webb translated in real time. "They're asking, they want to know if this is some kind of trick. They say they've heard of humans who pretend to help and, then, turn refugees over to Imperial bounty hunters." The accusation stung because it was probably true. The Empire's expansion had created a thriving market for refugee hunting, and not all of the participants were officially sanctioned. Pirates and mercenaries could make good money capturing escaped aliens and selling them back to imperial slave markets. "Tell them," Camilla said slowly, "that I am Princess Camilla Voss, daughter of Emperor Theron, and I have been exiled from the Terran Empire for defending alien rights. Tell them I offer them sanctuary and assistance with no conditions except that they allow us to help." This caused a longer pause. When the response came, even without translation, Camilla could hear the shock in the Velix captain's voice. They're asking if you're really the human princess who spoke against the Empire at the Proxima 7 conference, Webb reported. "Apparently, recordings of your speech have been circulating through the refugee networks. They want to know if you're really willing to help them." "Yes," Camilla said simply. "We are willing to help. Please prepare to receive assistance teams." What followed was 3 hours of frantic activity as the Defiant's crew worked to save the refugee convoy. Engineers transferred emergency power cells to ships with failing reactors. Medical personnel treated hundreds of injured Velix packed into cargo holds never meant for passengers. The ship's fabricators worked overtime producing food and medicine for people who hadn't had a proper meal in days. Camilla found herself working alongside Chief Medical Officer Dr. James Murphy, a man who had been court-martialed for refusing to perform medical experiments on alien prisoners. Together, they moved through the cramped corridors of the lead refugee ship, treating injuries and trying to provide comfort where they could. The Velix were a graceful species, taller than humans and covered in fine, colorful fur that shifted patterns based on their emotional state. Right now, most of them showed the dull brown patterns that indicated depression and trauma. Many of the refugees were children, their large eyes wide with confusion and fear as they clung to parents who had no answers for what had happened to their world. "Commander," Dr. Murphy said quietly as they worked, "I need to ask, what's our plan here? We can keep these ships running for maybe another week with our current supplies, but after that?" It was a good question, and one Camilla had been wrestling with since they had first received the distress call. The Defiant could carry perhaps 100 passengers in addition to her crew, but the refugee convoy held nearly 3,000 Velix. Even if they managed to reach the Nexus, the station's resources were limited. "We get them to safety first," she said, carefully applying a healing gel to a young Velix's burned arm. "Then, we figure out what comes next. And if the Imperial forces are still hunting them?" Camilla paused in her work. The child she was treating looked up at her with eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young. This little one had seen their world burn, had watched everything they knew destroyed by weapons that could crack planets. And they were looking to her, a human, a member of the species responsible for that destruction, for protection. "Then, we protect them," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes." As they worked, the Velix captain of the lead ship, an elderly female named Keeper Sylvana, sought Camilla out. Her fur showed the deep blue patterns of respect and gratitude, but also the red streaks of anger that ran deeper than any ocean. "Princess Camilla," she said in accented but clear standard, "my people have heard stories of you. Stories that gave us hope when hope was hard to find. But, I must ask, why do you help us? We are not your people. Our deaths would mean nothing to your empire." It was a fair question, and one that deserved an honest answer. "Because someone has to," Camilla said simply. "Because if we don't help each other, then the galaxy becomes nothing but predators and prey. Because I've seen too much death and suffering, and I refuse to see more if I can prevent it." Keeper Sylvana studied her carefully, her fur patterns shifting to show contemplation. "You speak like the old stories our grandparents told. Stories of when the galaxy was young and different species worked together instead of one trying to dominate all others." "Maybe that's because I believe those old stories had the right idea," Camilla replied. "Maybe the galaxy doesn't have to be the way it is now." This seemed to satisfy the Velix elder, at least partially. She nodded slowly and returned to helping her people, but Camilla caught her watching her from time to time, as if trying to decide whether this human might actually be different from the ones who had destroyed her world. By the time the immediate crisis was over, word had begun to spread through the convoy. The human princess who had been exiled for defending aliens was here, was helping them, was offering them something no Velix had experienced in generations: hope. But, as they prepared to continue their journey to the Nexus, Ensign Webb picked up something on the long-range sensors that made everyone's blood run cold. "Ma'am," he reported, his voice tight with tension, "I'm reading multiple contacts dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. Configuration suggests Imperial patrol vessels. 3 ships, at least destroyer class." Camilla felt her heart sink. The Empire's grace period wasn't supposed to end for another 4 hours, but, apparently Admiral Corex had decided to start the hunt early. The patrol ships would have orders to destroy any vessel that helped her, which meant the refugee convoy was now a target simply by association. "Time until they reach us?" she asked. "At their current speed, approximately 90 minutes. 90 minutes to get 3,000 refugees to safety when their ships could barely limp along at quarter impulse." It was an impossible task, but she had to try. "All ships," she broadcast on the convoy frequency, "this is Commander Voss aboard the Defiant. Imperial forces have entered the system and are moving to intercept us. We need to reach the hyperspace limit and jump to safety. I know your ships are damaged, but we need everything you can give me." The response from Keeper Sylvana came immediately. "Commander Voss, our ships cannot outrun Imperial destroyers even in perfect condition. In our current state, we will be caught long before we can reach safety." Camilla stared at the tactical display, watching the red icons of the Imperial ships drawing steadily closer. The destroyers were fast, heavily armed, and crewed by people who had been trained to see aliens as expendable targets. If they caught the convoy, it would be a massacre. Unless someone bought them time. "Lieutenant Chen," she said quietly, "what's our maximum combat speed?" "Ma'am." Chen looked confused. "You're not thinking of engaging 3 Imperial destroyers with a light cruiser, are you? They'll blow us apart in minutes." "Not if we're smart about it," Camilla replied. "Mr. Webb, open a channel to all ships." When the channel was open, she spoke clearly and calmly, though her heart was racing. "Refugee convoy, this is the Defiant. We are going to engage the Imperial forces and buy you time to escape. Continue on your present course to the hyperspace limit. Do not stop for anything. We will rejoin you when we can." Keeper Sylvana's voice came back immediately, laden with distress. "Commander Voss, you cannot fight 3 destroyers alone. You will die for people you barely know." Camilla smiled sadly as she gave the order for the Defiant to change course, putting themselves between the convoy and the approaching Imperial ships. "Keeper Sylvana," she said, "that's exactly the point. In a galaxy where people are willing to die for strangers, tyranny can't survive." As the Defiant accelerated toward what would almost certainly be her final battle, Camilla realized that her exile was already accomplishing something her father had never intended. It was showing the galaxy that there was an alternative to the Empire's vision of human supremacy. It was showing them that some things were worth dying for. Even if you had never seen the faces of those you died to protect. The Defiant raced through space toward the 3 Imperial destroyers, her engines pushed beyond their recommended limits. On the bridge, Camilla watched the tactical display as the distance between her ship and the enemy vessels shrank with every passing second. Behind them, the Velix refugee convoy continued its painful crawl toward the hyperspace limit, their damaged ship straining to reach safety before the Imperial forces could intercept them. "Weapons range in 2 minutes, Lieutenant Chen reported from her station. The destroyers are maintaining formation. Looks like they're planning to punch straight through us and continue after the convoy." Camilla nodded grimly. The Imperial commanders probably thought this would be easy. 1 light cruiser against 3 destroyers was hardly a fair fight. They were expecting her to either surrender immediately or make some desperate gesture before being blown apart. What they weren't expecting was a fight. "Mr. Webb, any response to our hails?" "No, ma'am." They're maintaining communication silence. Of course they were. Admiral Corex had probably given them orders to shoot first and file reports later. Dead exiles couldn't contradict official accounts of their crimes, after all. "All hands, this is the commander," Camilla announced over the ship's internal communication system. "In approximately 90 seconds, we will engage Imperial forces to buy time for the refugee convoy to escape. I want everyone to know that participation in this action is completely voluntary. Anyone who wishes to surrender themselves to Imperial custody may report to the shuttle bay immediately. There will be no judgment and no consequences for that choice." She waited for 30 seconds, watching her crew work at their stations. No one moved toward the doors. No one even looked up from their duties. "Very well then," she said softly. "Let's give them a fight they'll remember." The first exchange of fire came exactly 91 seconds later. The lead destroyer, INS Retribution, opened up with its main plasma cannons while still at maximum range, clearly expecting to end the engagement quickly. The Defiant's shields flared as they absorbed the impact, energy reading spiking dangerously high. "Return fire," Camilla ordered. "Target their engines and weapon systems. I want them disabled, not destroyed if possible." It was a slim hope. She had no desire to kill Imperial sailors who were simply following orders, but it was better than nothing. The Defiant's weapons lanced out across space, finding their mark on the Retribution's port engine housing. Explosions bloomed along the destroyer's hull as secondary systems overloaded. But the other two destroyers, Vengeance and Righteous Fury, were already moving to flank the Defiant. Their combined firepower was more than her shields could handle for long. "Evasive maneuvers," Camilla called out as the ship shook under another barrage. "Take us into the asteroid field on the edge of the system. Use the rocks for cover." It was a dangerous strategy. The asteroid field was dense and unpredictable, full of debris that could tear a ship apart if the pilot made even a small mistake. But it would also limit the destroyer's ability to bring their superior numbers to bear. Lieutenant Chen threw the Defiant into a spiraling dive toward the asteroids, her hands dancing over the helm controls with practiced precision. Plasma bolts seared past them, close enough to cook the paint off their hull, but somehow they made it into the relative safety of the rock field. "Damage report," Camilla called out. "Shields down to 60%, Chief Engineer Torres reported from the back of the bridge. Port weapons array is offline, and we've got microfractures in the hull plating. But we're still in the fight." The destroyers followed them into the asteroid field, their larger size making them less maneuverable but also harder to damage. The Retribution was trailing plasma from her damaged engines, but she was still combat effective. The three Imperial ships spread out, trying to box the Defiant in against a particularly large asteroid cluster. "Ma'am," Ensign Webb called out, "I'm getting a priority transmission from the convoy. They're requesting permission to turn back and assist us." "Absolutely not," Camilla said firmly, even as she felt a warmth in her chest at the offer. "Tell them to continue to the hyperspace limit. Their safety is the whole point of this exercise." The battle raged for another 10 minutes, the Defiant darting between asteroids like a minnow pursued by sharks. They managed to score several hits on the destroyers, knocking out weapon systems and damaging their engines, but the enemy ships were still closing in. It was only a matter of time before the Defiant's luck ran out. That's when Ensign Webb picked up something unexpected on his sensors. "Commander," he said, his voice filled with confusion, "I'm reading new contacts entering the system. Multiple ships, unknown configuration. They're moving to intercept the destroyers." On the main viewer, space suddenly filled with light as a dozen new vessels dropped out of hyperspace. But these weren't Imperial ships, they were a mix of different designs and technologies, clearly belonging to multiple species. Some looked like converted freighters armed with military-grade weapons. Others appeared to be purpose-built warships, but, following design principles no human engineer would recognize. Incoming transmission, Webb reported. It's coming from the lead vessel in the new formation. Put it through. The voice that came through the speakers was deep and resonant, speaking accented but clear standard. This is Captain Thorek of the Free Alliance vessel Iron Storm. Princess Camilla, your reputation precedes you. We are here to assist. Camilla felt her heart skip. The Free Alliance was a loose confederation of refugee populations and resistance groups operating throughout the Dead Zone. She had been trying to make contact with them for months, but they were understandably suspicious of humans bearing gifts. Captain Thorek, I am grateful for your assistance, but you should know that engaging Imperial forces will make you targets for retaliation. The response came with what sounded like laughter. Commander Voss, we have been targets for retaliation since the day we refused to bow to your father's empire. Today, we finally have a chance to strike back alongside a human who shares our values. What followed was unlike any space battle Camilla had ever experienced. The Free Alliance ships fought with a coordination that spoke of years of desperate struggle, using tactics and technologies that Imperial doctrine had never encountered. They didn't try to match the destroyers' firepower, instead, they swarmed them, attacking from multiple vectors simultaneously and forcing the Imperial ships to divide their attention. The Kithra vessel Dancing Wind launched clouds of microdrones that attached themselves to the Vengeance's hull and began systematically disabling her sensor arrays. A modified Androxian freighter called the Star Singer used some kind of gravitic weapon to trap the Righteous Fury between two asteroids, leaving her unable to maneuver. Meanwhile, a sleek Thaxarian corvette named Swift Justice lived up to her name, darting in and out of weapons range too quickly for the Imperial gunners to track. Within minutes, the entire tactical situation had changed. The three Imperial destroyers found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered by an enemy that fought unlike anything they had been trained to face. The Retribution, already damaged from her earlier engagement with the Defiant, was the first to break off, turning away from the battle and accelerating toward the hyperspace limit. This is Captain Morrison of the INS Vengeance, a voice crackled over the communications system. We are withdrawing from the engagement. Princess Camilla Voss, you have chosen your allies poorly. The Empire will not forget this attack on Imperial vessels. Tell Captain Morrison, Camilla replied, that I hope he lives long enough to see the galaxy we're going to build. One where his children won't have to choose between conscience and career. The three destroyers jumped to hyperspace within minutes of each other, leaving the combined fleet of human exiles and alien freedom fighters alone among the asteroids. Camilla felt a mixture of relief and amazement. They had actually won. Somehow, against impossible odds, they had driven off 3 Imperial warships without losing a single vessel. Commander, Lieutenant Chen said quietly, we're receiving a transmission from the refugee convoy. They've reached the hyperspace limit safely. Camilla closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of pure gratitude. 3,000 Velix refugees were alive and safe because a bunch of exiles and outcasts had been willing to fight for people they had never met. It was the kind of victory that couldn't be measured in destroyed ships or captured territory. Captain Thorek, she said, opening a channel to the Iron Storm, I cannot adequately express my gratitude for your assistance today. You saved thousands of lives. As did you, Princess, came the reply. But, perhaps we should continue this conversation in person. The Nexus is only 6 hours from here, and I believe there are many things we need to discuss. The journey to the Nexus passed quickly, the combined fleet traveling together through hyperspace while Camilla tried to process everything that had happened. In less than a week, she had gone from Imperial heir to exile to unofficial leader of what appeared to be a growing resistance movement. The weight of that responsibility was both terrifying and exhilarating. The Nexus itself was an impressive sight, a massive space station built inside a hollowed-out asteroid that had been carved and shaped over generations by refugee populations seeking a place to call home. The exterior was covered in docking bays and communication arrays, while the interior had been divided into distinct neighborhoods representing dozens of different species and cultures. As the Defiant approached her assigned docking bay, Camilla could see the diversity of vessels that called the Nexus home. There were elegant Androxian art ships covered in luminescent patterns, blocky Coranian mining vessels built for durability over aesthetics, and sleek Thaxarian scouts designed for speed and stealth. It was like a museum of galactic civilization, representing all the cultures that the major empires had tried to suppress or destroy. Captain Thorek met them at the docking bay personally, and Camilla was surprised to see that he was Velix, like the refugees they had just rescued. His furs showed the deep purple patterns of leadership and authority, but also the silver streaks that marked someone who had seen too much suffering. "Princess," he said, inclining his head respectfully as she disembarked, "welcome to the Nexus. I hope your stay here will be the beginning of something important." "Just Camilla, please," she replied. "I'm not a princess anymore." "And I hope so too." Thorek led them through the station's corridors, past markets where traders from a dozen species hawked everything from rare metals to exotic foods. Children of various races played together in common areas, their laughter echoing off the metal walls. It was chaotic and loud and completely unlike the sterile perfection of Imperial space stations. It was beautiful. The Nexus was founded 40 years ago, Thorek explained as they walked, by refugees from the first Imperial expansion campaigns. Over the decades, it has grown into something unique, a place where species that have never shared worlds can work together for mutual protection and prosperity. They entered a large conference chamber where representatives from dozens of different species were already waiting. Camilla recognized some of them from her travels: Coranian merchants, Thaxarian ship captains, Androxian artists who had fled their homeworld when it was turned into a factory complex. Others were completely unknown to her, refugees from conflicts she had never heard of. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thorek announced as they entered, "may I present Camilla Voss, formerly Princess of the Terran Empire, currently a free citizen of the galaxy and friend to all who oppose tyranny." The applause that greeted her was nothing like the roar that had accompanied her exile from the Imperial Senate. This was quiet, respectful, and filled with genuine hope. These were people who had lost everything to Imperial expansion, and yet they were welcoming her, a human, a member of the species responsible for their suffering, as an ally. "Thank you," she said simply. "I know that my species has caused immeasurable harm throughout the galaxy. I know that trusting a human, even an exiled one, goes against every survival instinct you've developed. But, I want you to know that there are others like me. Humans who believe that the Empire's vision of the future is wrong, and who are willing to fight for something better." An elderly Coranian woman, her stone-like skin marked with the ritual scars of her people, stood up from her seat. "We have heard stories of humans who question their empire's actions," she said in a voice like grinding rocks. "But, we have also heard stories of humans who pretend to be friends while planning betrayal. Why should we believe that you are different?" It was a fair question, and one that Camilla had been expecting. "Because," she said, meeting the Coranian's gaze directly, "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to let me prove myself. Judge me by my actions, not my words. And, if I ever betray the principles I claim to hold, then, treat me as the enemy I would have become." The conference room fell silent as the assembled representatives considered her words. Finally, a young Thaxarian male spoke up. "What exactly are you proposing, Camilla Voss? What future do you envision for the galaxy?" Camilla took a deep breath. This was the moment when her exile would either become a footnote in Imperial history or the beginning of something that could change the galaxy forever. "I propose an alliance," she said. "Not just between our peoples, but between all those who believe that diversity makes us stronger, that cooperation is better than conquest, and that every sentient being has the right to live free from fear. I propose that we stop running and start building. That we create something here in the dead zone that the galaxy has never seen before, a true confederation of free peoples, united not by force but by common values." The room erupted in discussion as representatives talked among themselves, debating the implications of what she had proposed. Some voices were skeptical, others hopeful, but all were engaged. For the first time in decades, the scattered refugees and resistance groups were talking about something other than simple survival. They were talking about victory. As the debate continued around her, Camilla felt a moment of clarity about her path forward. The Empire had exiled her, believing they were sending her to die in obscurity among the alien scum of the galaxy's edge. Instead, they had sent her exactly where she needed to be to plant the seeds of their own destruction. The revolution had begun, and it would be built not on hatred and conquest, but on the radical idea that all life had value. Her father would learn, eventually, that his greatest mistake hadn't been having a daughter who questioned his methods. It had been assuming that exile would silence her voice, when instead it had given her an audience of billions who were desperate to hear a message of hope. 6 months after the conference at the Nexus, the dead zone was no longer dead. What had once been empty space populated only by refugees and pirates had transformed into something unprecedented in galactic history, a thriving confederation of free peoples working together despite their differences. The transformation was so rapid and so complete that Imperial intelligence agencies were scrambling to understand how it had happened so quickly. The answer was simpler than they suspected. When people who have lost everything find something worth fighting for, they work miracles. Camilla stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed station called Haven, watching as construction crews from a dozen different species worked together to complete the latest expansion. Quranian engineers worked alongside Thaxarian architects, while Velix agricultural specialists planned the hydroponic gardens that would feed the growing population. Each species contributed their unique skills and knowledge, creating something that was greater than the sum of its parts. The latest intelligence reports from our contacts in Imperial space, Captain Thorax said, approaching with a data pad in his hands. Over the months, he had become her unofficial second-in-command, though the Free Alliance had no formal hierarchy. Decisions were made by consensus, with Camilla serving more as a coordinator than a commander. "What's the word from the core worlds?" she asked, accepting the pad and scanning its contents. "Mixed. On one hand, your father has declared the dead zone a quarantine sector and forbidden all Imperial ships from entering our territory. On the other hand, we're receiving more refugees every week, and some of them are bringing interesting news." Camilla frowned as she read the intelligence summary. The Empire's response to their growing confederation had been predictably harsh. Several border worlds had been placed under martial law after their populations expressed support for the Dead Zone Rebellion. Trade with non-human species had been further restricted, and new laws had been passed making it illegal to possess recordings of Camilla's speeches. But there were also signs that the Empire's iron grip was beginning to slip. Work slowdowns and sabotage in alien labor camps were becoming more frequent. Imperial Navy recruitment was down as young humans began questioning whether they wanted to serve in an organization dedicated to oppression. Most significantly, there were reports of entire Imperial units defecting when ordered to bombard civilian targets. "The Cygnus sector garrison?" Camilla asked, highlighting one particularly interesting report. 3 destroyers and their escort vessels, Thorek confirmed. They were ordered to sterilize a Calthrian colony that had been smuggling food to refugee camps. Instead, they helped evacuate the population and, then, disappeared into hyperspace. Imperial Command is calling it a mutiny, but our sources say the entire crew voted unanimously to defect. Camilla smiled grimly. The Empire was discovering that it was one thing to demand blind obedience from soldiers who had never seen the faces of their victims, and quite another to maintain that obedience when those soldiers were forced to confront the reality of what they were doing. "Any word on where they went?" "Unknown, but I suspect we'll be seeing them soon. Word is getting out that we exist, and that we're offering sanctuary to anyone who refuses to participate in genocide." The sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Dr. Sarah Kim, the Confederation's chief scientist, approached with an expression that mixed excitement with barely contained glee. The former Imperial researcher had been exiled for refusing to develop biological weapons targeted at specific alien species, and she had thrown herself into her new role with the enthusiasm of someone finally allowed to use her talents for good. "Camilla, you need to see this," she said, holding up her own data pad. "We've just received the most incredible intelligence from our network on Proxima 7. Proxima 7 was one of the border worlds that had been placed under martial law, but it was also home to one of the most extensive underground networks in Imperial space. Sympathizers there had been feeding information to the Confederation for months, helping them track Imperial fleet movements and rescue operations." "What kind of intelligence?" Camilla asked. "The kind that could change everything," Dr. Kim replied, her eyes bright with possibility. "Remember Project Ascension?" Camilla felt her blood turn cold. Project Ascension was one of the Empire's most classified research programs, focused on developing technology that would allow humans to dominate other species not just militarily, but biologically. The few details she had learned during her time as heir apparent had been enough to convince her that her father's ambitions went far beyond simple conquest. "What about it?" "Our sources have managed to obtain the complete research files," Dr. Kim said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Camilla, they're not just trying to develop weapons. They're trying to rewrite the genetic code of every non-human species in the galaxy. They want to turn every alien into a docile servant race, incapable of independent thought or resistance." The implications hit Camilla like a physical blow. If the Empire succeeded with Project Ascension, it wouldn't just mean the conquest of alien species, it would mean their complete erasure as thinking beings. Every Velix child, every Koranian artist, every Thaxarian poet would be reduced to a biological machine designed to serve human interests. "How close are they to success?" she asked quietly. "According to these files, they've already begun preliminary testing on captured populations. The Zephyrian mining colonies have been completely converted. 20 million people, reduced to empty shells that can only follow simple commands. Thorax fur patterns shifted to the deep black of rage and horror. The Zephyrians were known throughout the galaxy for their music and literature. Their songs could move listeners to tears across species lines. Not anymore," Dr. Kim said sadly. "According to the reports, they don't even remember their own names." Camilla stared out at the construction crews working on Haven's expansion, watching beings from dozens of species working together in harmony. In a few hours, they would gather for the evening meal, sharing food and stories and laughter despite having no common language beyond the universal bond of sapience. The idea that her father would destroy all of that, would reduce these vibrant people to mindless drones, filled her with a cold fury that surprised her with its intensity. "How long before they can implement this on a galactic scale?" she asked. "The timeline suggests they're planning to begin mass deployment within 2 years, Dr. Kim replied. "They want to start with the major refugee populations, the ones most likely to resist imperial authority." "Which means us," Thorax said quietly. "They'll come for the dead zone first." Camilla nodded grimly. The Confederation had grown rapidly, but they were still vastly outgunned by Imperial forces. They had perhaps 50 combat-capable ships against the Empire's thousands, and their population numbered in the millions while the Empire controlled billions. In a straight military confrontation, they would be crushed within days. But they weren't planning a straight military confrontation. "Dr. Kim," Camilla said slowly, "in your professional opinion, could this technology be reversed? Could someone who had been subjected to the process be restored to their original state?" The scientist considered the question carefully. "The research files suggest that the process causes permanent damage to neural pathways associated with higher cognitive function. But there might be ways to compensate. Cybernetic implants, genetic therapy, even simple retraining could potentially restore some functionality. It would be a long process, and not all subjects would recover fully, but it might be possible." "Then, that's our mission," Camilla said firmly. "We stop Project Ascension before it can be deployed, and we rescue as many of its victims as we can." "That's insane," Thorax said, though his tone suggested he was already considering how it might be done. The research is being conducted on Tartarus Station, deep in the heart of Imperial space. It's one of the most heavily defended installations in the galaxy. Which is exactly why they won't expect an attack, Camilla replied. The Empire has grown complacent. They assume that no one would dare strike at their core facilities. Over the next few hours, word of Project Ascension spread through the Confederation's leadership. The response was immediate and unanimous. This could not be allowed to continue. Plans began forming for the most audacious military operation in galactic history, a strike at the very heart of the Terran Empire to destroy a research program that threatened the freedom of every thinking being in the galaxy. The planning took months. Intelligence networks throughout Imperial space worked to gather information about Tartarus Station's defenses, staff rotations, and security protocols. Engineers analyzed the stolen research data to identify critical systems that could be destroyed to set back the program permanently. Most importantly, sympathizers within the Imperial military were contacted to determine how much support they might provide for such an operation. The response was encouraging. It seemed that knowledge of Project Ascension was not limited to the highest levels of Imperial command, and many officers who had been willing to accept conquest and, even genocide drew the line at complete mental enslavement. Secret meetings were held on distant worlds, code phrases were passed through seemingly innocent communications, and, slowly a network of resistance formed within the Empire's own military structure. The plan that eventually emerged was complex and dangerous, requiring precise timing and no small amount of luck. A combined fleet of Confederation and Imperial defector vessels would strike at Tartarus Station while the main Imperial fleet was engaged in exercises on the far side of the galaxy. The attack would be swift and brutal, designed not to capture the station but to destroy it utterly before reinforcements could arrive. But the most dangerous part of the mission would fall to Camilla herself. "You don't have to do this," Captain Thorex said as they reviewed the final mission parameters aboard his flagship. "We can find another way to access the central research computers." Camilla shook her head. "The biometric locks require Imperial Royal DNA to access. There's no one else who can do it." The plan called for Camilla to infiltrate the station during the attack and download the complete Project Ascension database before it could be destroyed. More importantly, she would need to access the control systems that governed the test subjects' containment and life support. If they were going to rescue the Zephyrians and other victims, someone needed to keep them alive during the evacuation. "The timeline doesn't allow for extraction," Lieutenant Chen pointed out from her position at the tactical display. She had been promoted to commander of the Confederation's newly formed intelligence division. "If everything goes according to plan, you'll have maybe 20 minutes before the station's reactor goes critical. That's not enough time to reach the evacuation points." "I know," Camilla said simply. "But, someone has to make sure those people get out alive. If that means I don't make it, then, that's a price I'm willing to pay." The room fell silent. Everyone present understood the implications. Camilla was volunteering for what amounted to a suicide mission. She would infiltrate the most secure facility in the galaxy, steal its most sensitive secrets, and, then, ensure the rescue of thousands of victims, all while the station was exploding around her. "There might be another way," Dr. Kim said quietly. "The research files mention emergency stasis pods for critical test subjects. If you could reach one of those." "That's a long shot," Camilla replied. "But, it's better than nothing." As the final preparations were made, Camilla found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. Less than a year ago, she had been the heir to the greatest empire in galactic history, destined to inherit power beyond imagination. Now she was planning to die to save people her former subjects would have considered worthless. The irony wasn't lost on her that her father's greatest fear, that she would betray everything he had built, was about to come true. But, as she looked around at the diverse faces of the Confederation leadership, all united in their determination to prevent a galactic atrocity, she realized that she hadn't betrayed anything worth preserving. The empire her father had built was a monument to hatred and fear, sustained by the belief that might made right. What they were building here was something different. Something based on the radical idea that every thinking being had value, regardless of species or origin. Something worth dying for. The attack on Tartarus Station was scheduled to begin in 72 hours. It would either mark the beginning of the Empire's downfall, or the end of the last hope for galactic freedom. Either way, the galaxy would never be the same. The attack on Tartarus Station began exactly as planned, with the sudden appearance of the Confederation fleet at the edge of the system. Imperial sensors immediately began screaming warnings as 37 ships of various configurations dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, their weapons already powering up for combat. From the bridge of the modified Androxian stealth ship Whisper in the dark, Camilla watched the first exchange of fire light up the void. The station's defensive platforms opened up immediately, their massive plasma cannons reaching out across space to engage the attacking fleet. But, the Confederation had learned from their earlier encounters with Imperial forces, they didn't try to match firepower with firepower. Instead, they used speed, coordination, and the element of surprise. A squadron of Thaxarian fighters darted between the defensive platforms, their pilots using techniques that Imperial tacticians had never encountered. Instead of attacking head-on, they wove complex patterns that confused the automated targeting systems, creating overlapping fields of sensor interference that made it impossible for the platforms to lock on. Meanwhile, the heavier Confederation ships focused their fire on the station's communication arrays and sensor networks. If they could blind and deafen Tartarus Station, they could prevent it from calling for reinforcements until it was too late. Defensive grid is down by 60%, reported Commander Chen from the flagship Iron Storm. Beginning approach to Docking Bay 7. That was Camilla's cue. The Whisper in the dark was too small to be detected by the station's remaining sensors, and its Androxian cloaking technology made it effectively invisible to human detection systems. While the main battle raged outside, she would slip through the chaos and infiltrate the station's central core. Good hunting, Camilla, Captain Thorak's voice crackled through the communication system. Remember, you have 20 minutes once the reactor overload begins. Don't try to be a hero. Camilla smiled grimly as she guided her ship through the debris field that had already formed around the station. Too late for that advice, my friend. The infiltration went smoothly at first. Tartarus Station had been built for security, not to resist a full-scale military assault, and the chaos of the battle had drawn most of the security forces away from the interior sections. Camilla made her way through corridors that hummed with the sound of scientific equipment, past laboratories where the most horrific research in galactic history was being conducted. She tried not to look through the observation windows as she passed, but occasionally she caught glimpses that made her stomach turn. Test subjects strapped to examination tables, their eyes vacant and staring. Monitoring equipment that tracked the systematic destruction of everything that made them who they were. Scientists in clean white coats taking notes as they reduced thinking beings to biological machines. The central computer core was located at the station's heart, protected by multiple layers of security that would have been impossible to breach under normal circumstances. But, these weren't normal circumstances, and Camilla had advantages that the station's designers had never anticipated. The first layer was a simple access code, which she bypassed using credentials that technically still existed in the Imperial database. Despite her exile, no one had thought to revoke her emergency access permissions, a bureaucratic oversight that was about to prove costly. The second layer required biometric confirmation, scanning her DNA and neural patterns to confirm her identity. The system hesitated for a moment, clearly confused by the presence of someone who was supposed to be dead or exiled, but eventually accepted her genetic markers and allowed her through. The third layer was the most insidious, a psychological evaluation designed to detect anyone who might be operating under coercion or suffering from mental compromise. Questions flashed across the screen, probing her loyalty to the Empire, her commitment to human supremacy, her willingness to sacrifice alien lives for the greater good. Camilla answered them all with the responses she would have given a year ago, back when she was still trying to be the daughter her father wanted. It was like putting on old clothes that no longer fit, uncomfortable and confining, but necessary for the task at hand. Finally, the last barrier fell, and she was inside the central database. The scope of Project Ascension was even worse than they had feared. Files detailed experiments on dozens of species, each one targeted for specific modifications that would make them more useful as slave labor. The Veliks were being modified to be better agricultural workers, their natural empathy stripped away so they couldn't form emotional bonds that might lead to rebellion. The Koranians were being altered to be more efficient miners, their artistic nature suppressed in favor of mindless productivity. But, it was the files on the Zephyrians that made her blood run cold. The Empire hadn't just destroyed their higher brain functions, they had deliberately preserved their musical abilities while removing their capacity for independent creativity. They were being turned into living instruments, capable of producing beautiful sounds but, unable to compose anything new or express their own thoughts through music. Download complete, she whispered to herself as the data transfer finished. Every file, every research note, every horrible detail of the project was now stored in the Confederation's databases. But, that was only half the mission. The test subject containment area was 3 levels down, accessible only through a heavily secured transport tube. As Camilla made her way through the station, the sounds of battle grew louder and more intense. Explosions echoed through the corridors as the Confederation fleet systematically destroyed the station's critical systems. 10 minutes to reactor overload, Commander Chen's voice crackled through her communicator. Camilla, you need to get out of there now. Not yet, she replied, reaching the containment level. I still have work to do. The sight that greeted her in the containment area was something that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. Thousands of beings from dozens of species were held in rows of sterile white cells, each one connected to monitoring equipment that tracked the systematic destruction of their minds. Most sat motionless, staring at nothing with empty eyes. Others moved through repetitive motions, performing simple tasks over and over again like broken toys. But, some, a precious few, still showed signs of awareness. Their eyes tracked movement, their faces showed emotion, and, when they saw Camilla approaching their cells, something like hope flickered in their expressions. Emergency evacuation protocol activated, she announced to the station's computer system, using her override codes to open every containment cell simultaneously. All test subjects to be transferred to emergency transport. Alarms began blaring as the cell doors opened and the test subjects began to move. Most of them simply stood where they were, lacking the initiative to flee on their own. But, the ones who still retained some awareness began helping the others, guiding them toward the evacuation routes that Camilla had highlighted on the station's emergency displays. 5 minutes to reactor overload, came the warning from outside. All personnel evacuate immediately. Camilla ran through the corridors, helping to guide confused and traumatized beings toward the escape pods and emergency shuttles. The Confederation fleet was already beginning to withdraw, their mission accomplished, but they had left behind several fast transport ships to evacuate as many victims as possible. She was helping a group of Zephyrian children when the station shook with a massive explosion. The reactor containment was beginning to fail, and she could feel the deck plates vibrating under her feet as the artificial gravity fluctuated. 2 minutes to critical failure, the computer announced with typical Imperial efficiency. All remaining personnel will be terminated in 90 seconds. Camilla looked around the evacuation area and realized that there were still dozens of test subjects who hadn't made it to the transport ships. They moved too slowly, were too confused, or were simply too damaged to navigate the evacuation routes on their own. She could save herself, there was still time to reach one of the emergency stasis pods that Dr. Kim had mentioned. But, that would mean leaving these people behind to die in the station's destruction. It wasn't really a choice at all. This is Camilla Voss, she broadcast on all frequencies as she began herding the remaining test subjects toward the nearest transport ship. To any Confederation vessels still in the area, I'm transmitting the location of emergency stasis pods containing additional survivors. Please retrieve them if possible. Camilla. Captain Thorek's voice cut through the static. The transport ships are at capacity and, already launching. You need to get out now. Negative, she replied, pushing a confused Coranian male toward the transport ship's boarding ramp. There are still people here who need help. The final minute passed in a blur of activity as she managed to get the last of the mobile test subjects aboard the remaining transport. The ship's pilot, a young Velix female named Kessa, looked at her with tears in her large eyes. "Commander, there's room for one more," she called out over the rising whine of the ship's engines. Camilla shook her head and stepped back from the boarding ramp. "Take care of them, Kessa. They're going to need time to heal." The transport ship sealed its hatches and lifted off just as the station's reactor went critical. The explosion that followed was visible from several light-years away, a brief new star that marked the end of the Empire's most horrific research program. But Camilla didn't see it. She was already in the emergency stasis pod she had reached with seconds to spare, her life signs reduced to barely detectable levels as the pod systems protected her from the radiation and debris of the station's destruction. The pod's distress beacon would broadcast for months, hoping that someone would eventually find her and wake her up. If she was lucky. 3 days later, a Confederation search and rescue ship detected the beacon's weak signal among the wreckage of Tartarus Station. When they cracked open the stasis pod, they found Camilla Voss unconscious but alive, her vital signs stable despite exposure to massive amounts of radiation. She woke up in the medical bay of Haven Station 2 weeks later, to find Dr. Kim standing beside her bed with a smile that could have powered a small star. "Welcome back to the living," the doctor said softly. "You gave us quite a scare." "The test subjects," Camilla said immediately, her voice hoarse from the stasis drugs. "Did we save them?" "We saved over 8,000 people," Dr. Kim replied. "Not all of them will recover completely, but our preliminary examinations suggest that many can be helped with therapy and treatment. The Zephyrians in particular are already beginning to show signs of creative thought returning." Camilla closed her eyes and felt tears of relief rolling down her cheeks. 8,000 lives saved, and the research that would have enslaved billions destroyed forever. It was a victory beyond anything she had dared to hope for. "There's something else you should know," Dr. Kim continued. "The destruction of Tartarus Station has had unexpected consequences throughout Imperial space." Over the following hours, Camilla learned about the revolution that her sacrifice had sparked. News of Project Ascension's existence had been broadcast throughout the galaxy, along with evidence of the Empire's plans to enslave every non-human species. The reaction had been swift and devastating to Imperial authority. Entire sectors had declared independence, their populations rising up against Imperial governors and military commanders. The Imperial fleet was scattered across the galaxy, trying to suppress dozens of simultaneous rebellions. Most significantly, over half of the Imperial military had defected, their officers and crews unwilling to participate in genocide on such a massive scale. Emperor Theron still held the core worlds, but his empire was crumbling around him. What had once been a 1,000-world domain now consisted of perhaps 50 systems that remained loyal to the old regime. "And the Confederation?" Camilla asked. "Growing every day," Captain Thorek said, entering the medical bay with a data pad full of reports. "We've gone from a few dozen refugee populations to a legitimate government representing over 300 systems. Species that have been enemies for centuries are working together now, united by the idea that you helped us articulate." "Which idea was that?" "That diversity makes us stronger. That cooperation is better than conquest. That every thinking being has value, regardless of what they look like or where they come from." Camilla smiled weakly. Those were the same words she had spoken at that first conference in the Nexus, what seemed like a lifetime ago. The fact that they had become the founding principles of a new galactic civilization was both humbling and inspiring. "What about my father?" she asked quietly. Thorek and Dr. Kim exchanged glances. "He's declared you a terrorist and placed a bounty on your head that could buy a small planet," Thorak said. But, he's also asked for peace talks. Peace talks? He wants to negotiate a treaty with the Confederation. Mutual recognition, defined borders, an end to hostilities. Our intelligence suggests that his remaining advisors have convinced him that the Empire can't win a prolonged war against our coalition. Camilla considered this for a moment. A year ago, she had been an imperial princess whose father ruled half the galaxy. Now she was a terrorist whose rebellion had destroyed his empire and was forcing him to negotiate from a position of weakness. Set up the meeting, she said finally. But, make it clear that any treaty will include full recognition of the rights of all species, an end to slavery and forced labor, and reparations for the victims of imperial aggression. And, if he refuses? Camilla's smile turned cold. Then, we finish what we started. The galaxy has seen what freedom looks like, Thorak. They're not going to give it up just because my father doesn't want to admit he was wrong. As the days passed and preparations for the historic peace conference began, Camilla found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. She had started as a privileged princess questioning her father's methods. She had become an exile, then, a refugee, then, a rebel, and, finally, a revolutionary. But, more importantly, she had become something that the galaxy had never seen before, a human leader who genuinely believed that her species was not inherently superior to any other. A human who had risked everything to prove that cooperation was stronger than conquest, that diversity was more valuable than uniformity, and that freedom was worth any sacrifice. The negotiations with her father would be difficult. Building a lasting peace between species that had been enemies for generations would be even harder. There would be setbacks and failures, moments when the old hatreds threatened to overwhelm the new hope. But, for the first time in galactic history, there was a realistic chance for something better. A chance for a civilization built not on the domination of the strong over the weak, but on the idea that all life had value. It was a future worth fighting for. And, Camilla Voss, once princess of the Terran Empire, now citizen of the galaxy and friend to all who cherished freedom, intended to see it built. The palace doors that had sealed her fate amid roaring applause had been meant to mark the end of her story. Instead, they had marked the beginning of the greatest story in galactic history, the tale of how a princess became a rebel, how an exile became a liberator, and how humanity finally learned that their greatest strength came not from ruling others, but from standing as equals among the stars. The galaxy would never be the same. And that was exactly as it should be.